Here now is about art, music, poetry, creativity, and why these matter enormously to Ukraine right now. And I can guarantee that for all of you who live in Ukraine, the next session will be the one that actually impresses your children far more. Because we have two people who are very famous inside Ukraine and getting to be famous outside Ukraine because they've been touring a lot outside Ukraine. Eugene Hütz, who's a frontman of the Gogol Bordello band, I don't think Larry Fink didn't get that cheer. Someone who's a fellow New Yorker who has been tirelessly championing Ukrainian creativity and music in America, now in Ukraine, and is very much a beacon for Ukraine's music industry and creativity. And then Serhiy Zhadan, who is a poet, novelist, artist, and has a band, Zhadan and Sobaky, Zhadan and the Dogs, an extraordinarily multi-talented artist who has done some absolutely remarkable work, tirelessly, both of them tirelessly touring throughout Ukraine to speak to ordinary Ukrainians, to boost their morale, to keep them focused, but also going to the West and outside Ukraine to try and drum up support and maintain attention on Ukraine. So, first of all, thank you both very much indeed for the work you've done. And I'd like to start by reading out a quote from one of your songs, the Silly Peremohi, which is, "When I think I cannot go on anymore, I suddenly know that we will win. When I am halfway, the powers of victory wake up." Many people outside Ukraine were very surprised, and I'd like to ask you first, Eugene, about the degree of resilience that the Ukrainians displayed as a nation, as a society, when the invasion happened. Were you surprised by that? And how has the Ukrainian spirit changed in the last 18 months?
Well, actually, when it began, a lot of my friends in New York and beyond New York called me and said, "What do you think is going to happen?" And they were coming from a very right, concerned place because, they're my friends, and for a lot of them, I am their only connection to Ukraine, And I said, "What do you mean it's going to happen? We're going to win." And now they're calling me back and saying, "Remember how you said that?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." I said, "Well, what gave you the confidence to say that? I mean, to them, it looked quite unrealistic that something like that would go in a favor of Ukraine." Because I was like, "Listen, it's very easy to understand. You're subject to mythology. You're operating on mythology of some kind of delusion of grandeur of Moscow, and I'm not, because I am from Ukraine, and it's on my genetic code. I know the vibe." And also I said, all my uncle's father and all my siblings and everybody, they've been to Ukrainian army or beyond army and all kind of other tough environments, and they know that Ukrainian people are actually a lot more smarter and stronger than Russians. And I was speaking from experience, from my family experience, and I said, it's simply because I'm dispelled from any other fiction, And I'm not just championing Ukraine because I'm from Ukraine. I said, I'm actually laid you out a factual information how it's going to go down, because I have a very uniquely 360 idea of Ukraine. Part of my family is from East Ukraine, part of them is from West Ukraine, and I was born and raised in Kyiv, and I have a pretty good balanced understand. I was here until I was 16 years old.
Right.
So I kind of have both sides of the Ukraine mentality, not that they're drastically different, but they are semi-different. So that in alone, operating on experience versus mythology, a Hollywood mythology, is what gives that insight.
Right. I'm going to turn to Serhiy in just a minute. I would ask you, who do not speak Ukrainian, to put in your earpieces, because he will be speaking in Ukrainian with a translator. So do find them if you can now. But before I turn to him, I'd like to ask you, Eugene, as you have gone around touring and speaking to ordinary Ukrainians, what do you think is giving them the power to keep resisting?
I think that being from Ukraine is a very specific thing. It's more specific than it might appear to be. It's a very kind of a old mystical place that has a certain power that not everybody can understand and digest. But I also, like, for example, I lived in Brazil for a long time, and the Ukrainian community there, it was so impressively thriving that it was blowing my mind how tight they are amongst themselves and how deeply they preserve the culture. I'm not even talking about, the American and Canadian diaspora, which is like right there on the surface. I mean, I was immersed in it. I know it well, In New York City, it's everywhere you turn in East Village, or even in Bronx, there's Ukrainian this, Ukrainian that. So, I think the larger kind of, I'm not sure whose metaphor it was, but something of that Ukrainian beehive power. Yeah. So I'm not quite certain whose image it was, but somebody threw it out there in the world that Ukraine is kind of like beehive. It's working on its own thing. And if you're gonna mess with it, then all of these people gonna go aggro on you in a quite remarkable degree of unity.
And of course, if something messes with them, you can end up getting stung. We're going to have some music from both of you in a moment, but before I do, Serhiy, I'd like to ask you, you have spoken a lot about the Ukrainian spirit and the power of the Ukrainian spirit, but you've also spoken about the difference between Ukraine and Russia in terms of their spirit today. Can you explain to us a bit about what you mean by that? Because you've talked about Russia seeming like this mystical place, which of course has now been exposed, and yet you see Ukraine developing quite differently.
Ви знаєте, насправді порівнювати суспільства, порівнювати
Well, as a matter of fact, comparing peoples and nations is not a very rewarding thing. But we can do some comparisons if we take into account the historical background, because any country, any state has its own perception of history and the time continuum in which you live here and now. It can change, because 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, the situation was totally different, and Ukrainians and Russians could have told totally different things about themselves. But we live here and now, and to my humble opinion, we have totally different perception of history and our place in history. If we speak metaphorically, because we are creative people and we prefer metaphorical parallels and metaphors from show business. If you compare the Ukrainian society with the Russian one, the Ukrainian one is a young punk group which is ready to gather stadiums for their concerts, and they will definitely win over stadiums full of audience, because they have plenty of energy in stock. for them, and they have good understanding where they're going to move. Whereas the Russians are a kind of, jaded, slightly elderly, tired cabaret singer who has lost his audience and popularity, but still keeps trying to create an illusion of success and glamour. That's the whole difference between us. If you put a punk band and, relatively speaking, Frank Sinatra, punk band will be stronger and more vibrant. I think Ukrainians now have a perception of cohesion and unity of their nation, something we had never had before, and something which probably we had lost the skill to value because the post-Soviet paternal attitude was pretty much around, but now it is disappearing, it is evaporating, whereas in Russia it remains the name of the game. We have gone our separate ways, and it happened not 9 years ago, not on Maidan. It had happened much earlier. It has been going on for more than 30 years. The school of statecraft and the experience of state building for Ukrainians is much more important than for the Russians. And what we attained in 1991 was much more valuable for us than what Russians gained in 1991, because they viewed that as their tragedy. They just thought that they had lost a part of their territory, but whereas for us 1991 was an experience when we gained the status which we had aspired for the previous 200 to 300 years. And since that point we went separate ways with the Russians. For a certain period of time we were pretty much close to each other, but we were moving separate ways anyway. The Russians didn't want to realize that. Many Ukrainians refused to grasp that, but at some point we understood that if we want to be heard, we have to shout pretty loudly.
One of your most interesting statements that you've made was, you said, our leaders for a long time were not kings or queens, but poets. And that's something which, frankly, is quite hard for many Westerners or people outside Ukraine, in Europe or America, to understand and appreciate, because there are not many American poets who are regarded as inspiration and leaders, not even in much of the rest of Europe. So I'm curious, do you think one reason why the outside world failed to understand what was happening in terms of the development of Ukraine was that people were not sufficiently respectful or appreciative of the power of poetry and music in Ukraine?
Та ні, мені здається, якраз не так. Мені здається, що Україна
Not exactly. I'd rather say that Ukraine, being a quite standard post-colonial country, nicely fits into the image of countries that have their own prophets or moderators. Among the poets, I think it's quite characteristic for societies and nations going through traumatic search of their own national idea. The spring of the nations can be remembered, or take Taras Shevchenko, the prominent poet of Ukraine. It's quite understandably that we have a clear-cut, understandable algorithm, a country with no public institutions, with no statehood, is compelled to prop itself on intelligentsia. Science people, researchers, religious guys, cultural representatives. And really, sometimes these people are not as capable as the country would like them to be. Then appear government officials, generals, all sorts of political leaders, but still it is poets and cultural artists that provide the real sense for the nation. Without that, it may lead to a catastrophe, particularly for a nation with no statehood. Established one. This is what we lacked 100 years ago, when first attempt to establish Ukrainian statehood emerged, when there was the first try to separate from the empire. That time we had a lot of prophets among the poets, but we didn't have efficient generals to help them out. To say that now Ukraine has quite decent generals in spite of the war going on.
Let's hope in the future that they'll both be able to praise generals, politicians, business leaders, and poets and musicians, and maintain respect for that and the role for that. And Eugene, I mean, as we heard from Serhiy, in some ways, you know, Ukraine is like a young punk band, whereas Russia's like an aging cabaret singer. You are a young-ish punk band, still quite young. The question I have, though, is you must go around and hear, both of you, some terrible, terrible stories. I'm sure you must have friends and family friends or family who you know who've suffered terribly. You know, the whole of Ukraine right now is united in terrible suffering. How do you keep your own spirits up? And when you hear these terrible stories of sacrifice, do you see any sign that that is lessening the resolve of the Ukrainians?
You know, so it's a pretty complex question, but basically, this one time I had this enormous trauma in my shoulder, and I had to get this whole treatment. And as I was going through it, I ended up telling the healer that about my grandmother, who was from East Ukraine, and she passed away when she was 88. And the healer said, "Wow, she must have had a life with no stress. She had a great run." I said, "Yeah, she only survived Holodomor, went to war for 4.5 years, and then raised a family and dealt with constant KGB pressing. Other than that, no stress." Yeah. So I think there's historical trait of Ukrainian people is evolved into a quite serious degree of resilience. Perhaps a resilience that reminds right now the rest of the world of what human potential can even be. And not reminding it in a way of like a Hollywood movie or some kind of a montage. No, real life, real time, like this and like that. And it's quite striking to each and every one. It's striking to people here, striking to people out there even more so. It can only be amounted probably to the extreme history of the country itself, that it's already on genetic hard drive to have these traits that allow for extreme perseverance. And even if you take like history of Ukrainian immigration in 19th century, the people who went through that is like, this is not immigration like known now. I mean, people literally moved to like farthest possible provinces of Argentina or Paraguay or Canada, and like just some of them just died from being eaten by viruses and mosquitoes and animals they never encountered before, because those are unlivable areas. Yeah. And only Ukrainian people went there. So I don't want to get too mystical, but in the same time, there is a bit of a degree of kind of very historically evolved resilience that Ukrainian people do have, and that trait is undeniably there, and it's going to continue to be there. And this was probably the major fuck up that Russia had as a miscalculation. They completely forgot all about it. They did not realize this, and they stumbled over this.
Wow. one of many mistakes, tragic with tragic consequences.
One of many, yes.
Many mistakes. Before we ask you to play, I have one other big question, which is, we are surrounded by evidence of digital links. And one of the things that's given your poetry and your performances and your music such extraordinary power is that not only are you going around and meeting people face to face and performing in different places in a very emotional way, but of course people can also share these words and songs through these digital links. So I'd like you just to each reflect briefly on how you think the combination of poetry plus digital links, which of course is part of Ukraine's strength, has been so potent in maintaining the spirit of the Ukrainians. Perhaps, Eugene, you can start and then ask Serhiy.
I mean, it's a fact that Ukrainian tech generation, young generation, is totally kicking ass, and which has been one of the greatest strengths in this war. Besides that, besides all of that, besides tech power that Ukrainian minds have, also just informational war, and the whole Instagram phenomenon, things like that are very strongly on the side of Ukraine, and young people all over the world siding with that. Just like Ukrainian memes are much stronger than than the other side. It's a fact.
I think
it's more clever.
You are a meme, aren't you?
Well, it is in the time that we live in, there is a significant drop in people's ability to focus. It's a fact. Whether ADD is a fiction or not, whatever, people do use it to their own advantage, not to focus on anything. And so the time is short. You don't have time for a lecture to get somebody on your side. If they're wobbling and they have not realized the situation exactly, or they're just kind of a person who is quite withdrawn, we have to understand that, and Ukrainians do understand that we don't have the advantage of having a lecture time to convert them. We don't. We do have to work with their terms of their lack of focus, and we still have to get there fast. And I think that has been pretty well handled as far as Ukrainian minds who work in that field. I mean, it's a really strong front, and I'm quite proud and impressed by it. Yeah.
Serhiy, give us your thoughts about how digitization is amplifying what you're doing. Because of course, poetry plus this extraordinary digital reach, music plus this extraordinary digital reach is really very critical in terms of creating this united
Я би, з вашого дозволу, якщо ви дозволите,
with your permission, I'd still answer the first question you asked, Eugene, as to what brings this additional strength to the Ukrainians, where they get their resource from. Because this is rather an abstract question in itself, but if you're looking for the answer, you may end up with quite interesting results. Really, the question can be regularly heard here. Where do we get strength for? What can we feed ourselves, and so on. Sometimes they would say that the force can be drawn from the desire of revenge. Well, with war raging on since 2014, understandably, every one of us has some will for revenge. But I think in reality, this is where the difference sits. Maybe not everyone will agree with me, but my subjective understanding is that the Ukrainians in their majority are driven by the need for justice, not revenge. quite a remarkable difference, if you will, because revenge comes from aggression, from trauma, from violence, and definitely this is something felt by someone cornered, deeply cornered. Meanwhile, the need for justice grows from one's feeling of self-worth. And our revolution from 2014 was called the Revolution of Dignity. We tried to ridicule and ignore standard Russian narratives about it being like national coup d'etat and so on. From what I saw myself in the Ukrainian cities, at that time it was the need for justice, the need to be constructive in that, the need to build your own environment, your own outlook in this direction. And this is what drives the Ukrainians until now, despite stress, despite circumstances, despite the trauma. This remains. This is what gives us force, because great love and great prospects of something are behind it. The love for your living environment, for everyone around. Other things are not that clear. The freedom, the dignity, the responsibility are things that in our post-ironic world, post-information world, they have lost much of their value generally, worldwide. And we in Ukraine are rediscovering the true meanings. I think, becoming too close to death really makes pathos something you're rightfully entitled to. And this black and white perception sometimes is truly understandable.
Frankly, the rest of the world outside Ukraine can learn a lot from as well. I'm conscious that we've done a lot of talking. I think it's probably time for some music and for our own spirits to be uplifted by your creativity. I should remind everyone, of course, do feel free to use your phones to record this, but do not post until after the conference is over, as in line with the security guidelines. But anyway, over to you, enough talking.
Can I just please add something very quickly on the same topic, because I think it's a really great place to share this idea. It's kind of to elaborate on what Zhadan was saying, Serhiy. Right now, since we're doing with a reflection of like Ukrainian identity out there in the world and how it all builds and kind of comes out of all the, because of the extremity of the moment. A lot of times we're dealing with people asking us basically, what is the Ukrainian identity really, how do you break it fast to the people out there? And the thing is that what I found to be really interesting is that there is already so much impact that's done by Ukrainian culture out there. It's almost like a matter of Ukrainian people finding out themselves about it so they can reclaim it, what's already been done worldwide. Basic examples, Andy Warhol, then even basic pop culture things like that, a guy who was a fashion designer for Elvis Presley and Dolly Parton and Elton John, Nudie Cohen, he was from Kyiv. And, these are kind of things that I don't think in Ukraine nobody knows. But these are strong parts of Ukrainian culture that are there. Those outfits were so flamboyant for a reason, because they were so deeply Ukrainian spirited.
So for so long, Ukrainian culture has been rippling through.
It's already there in the fabric of the West. It's almost like more of a matter of connecting dots than trying to explain to people like, it's like this. It's like, it's like that. You already know this.
And now it's clicking into focus like a kaleidoscope and actually being celebrated in its own right, not simply subsumed under Russian culture. And that is indeed what has happened.
Yeah.
The birth of a nation in many ways. Right, let's have some music.
Yes, thank you.
Пять. Раз, два, три, четыре, пять.
Я що хотів сказати, насправді для тих, хто не зовсім розуміє, що буде відбуватися.
Those who do not quite understand what's going on, this is our band, Zhadan and Sobaky, Zhadan and Dogs. It is Zhenya Turchinov. Please welcome him. Our two projects, Gogol, Bordello and Zhadan and Sobaky, have two joint tracks. The first was issued last year, and this year it will be part of our album. And today we will be missing our drummer, but it will be compensated by the beat of your heart. And I believe that we can improvise together.
This is the first one. It's called Forces of the Victory. We wrote it right in the beginning of the war. It was very moment when there was a lack of sense of direction. And we kind of had to basically get people to the idea of what's happening fast. And this was the result. Коли здається, що більше не можу, то справді знаю, що переможе. Так прокидаються на півдороги. Сили перемоги, та прокидаються на півдороги. Сили перемоги, та прокидаються всередині. Сили перемоги. Це що залишиться навіки, це наше небо і наші ріки. Це світлі тіні Богородиць, ми залишили, щоб боротись. Ми тут жили і виростали, високе сонце над містами. Це нас тримає щохвилини, гаряче небо України. Це наші діти і дороги, крило пташине перемоги. Це ми освячені з тобою, і вогнями, і любов'ю. Та прокидається на півдороги. Сили перемоги, та прокидається всередині. Сили перемоги, та прокидається на півдороги. Сили перемоги, та прокидається всередині. Сили перемоги. Like I can't go on. I know that this game is on. That's how we can keep within forces of solidarity. That's how we can keep within forces of victory. That's how we can live within forces of victory. I can go on, I will go on. That's how I know the game is on. I will go on, I can't go on. That's how I know that game is on. Та прокидаються на півдороги. Сили перемоги. Та прокидаються всередині. Сили перемоги. Сили перемоги. Дякую, дякую.
Eugene Hütz! Ой, Бордело! А наша наступна пісня називається «П'ята авеню».
Наша музика вогню, приватні міста,
здавався такий темним і далеким. Хай тепер рок буде нашим саундтреком. Хай у цьому фільмі нині виживуть сміливі. Хай із наших звичок залишаються щасливі. Хай лишаться можливості для радості і відчаю. Я бачив пекло, я тепер про нього свідчу. Хай буде безперервною Господня безпорадність. Мені вже добре, я прийшов нести вам радість.
Yalta Avenue, це веселіша день по дню.
Це наша музика свободи, наша музика вогню. Втримані міста, чекай, рахуючи до 100. Це мій вогонь передається, теплим поливом в уста. Yalta Avenue, це веселіше день по дню. Це наша музика свободи, наша музика вогню. Втримані міста, чекай, рахуючи до 100. Це мій вогонь передається, теплим поливом в уста. Гей, братан, ти ж тримався цих мелодій. Хулі ти тепер почуваєшся як злодій. Хулі ти тепер соромишся коріння. Хто ще розповість про героїчне покоління? Це наші з тобою персонажі і герої. В країні так багато любові, зброї. Землі та при стресі вогню по вертикалі. Королева рок-н-ролу зависла на бек-вокалі.
Yalta Avenue, це веселіша день по дню.
Це наша музика свободи, наша музика вогню. Втримані міста, чекай, рахуючи до 100. Це мій вогонь передається, теплим поливом в уста. Yalta Avenue, це веселіша день по дню. Це наша музика свободи, наша музика вогню. Втримані міста, чекай, рахуючи до 100. Це мій вогонь передається, теплим поливом в уста.
Жека Турчинов, Жека Гуць.
Серхій Жадан.
Жека Гуць, Serhiy Zhadan.
Спасибі.
Thank
Друзі, і
you.
ми вам на завершення, почекайте, не
Our
розходьтеся.
friends, please do not disperse.
Розійдемося, коли ми зберемося.
You have probably become sour,
Дуже
but
чекаємо Юджина,
who
дуже
knows
чекаємо
when we
Борделло
will
з
be
концертами наступного року
here
в Україні.
again. We expect Eugene and Gogol,
Ми хочемо
Bordello
заспівати
in
пісню, вона не
Ukraine.
наша, себто
We
вона
want
народна,
also
вона наша,
to
вона українська народна.
sing the song,
Я
which is
припускаю, сподіваюся,
our
що
folk
українці
songs.
знають,
It
тому
is
можемо
our
співати.
songs, so
Доволі
we can
відома пісня, ми просто
sing in
вирішили
chorus.
зіграти щось таке, що всі знають. А пісня називається
Something that
«Шабелина».
everybody knows. Shabelina.
Ой, хмариться, туманиться, рівні дощі йдуть, а молоді жовнярики мед горілку п'ють, а молоді жовнярики мед горілку п'ють, п'ють горілку ще й наливку, їдять ягідки. Та ще й собі споглядають на чужі жінки, та ще й собі споглядають на чужі жінки. Чужа жінка, як ягідка, я в той маківці, а ти ж мені шабелино зав'язала світ. Аж ти ж мені шабелино зав'язала світ. Візьму я ще шабелино, хай загострий край. Пущу я ще шабелино, глибокий рунай. бренд Bordello, Zhadan, Sobaky. Дякуємо.
Thank you very much, Gogol, Bordello, and Zhadan and dogs.
Слава Україні!
Glory to Ukraine.
Дякую, Віктор.
Thank you, Victor.